Sarah's hands trembled as she held the delicate silver necklace up to the afternoon light streaming through her grandmother's kitchen window. The engraving on the back of the heart-shaped pendant was barely visible, worn smooth by decades of wear, but she could just make out the words, "Return to Fort Mason." "Gran, what's Fort Mason?" Sarah asked, turning toward the elderly woman who sat hunched over a cup of tea at the wooden table. Eleanor's cup clinked against the saucer as her hands shook slightly. At 87, her grandmother had lived through more than most people could imagine, but Sarah had never seen that particular look cross her face before, a mixture of fear and longing that made her stomach tighten with unease. "Where did you find that?" Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. "It was in the jewelry box you gave me, the one from your bedroom dresser. You said I could have anything in it after you moved into the assisted living facility next month." Sarah sat down across from her grandmother, still holding the necklace. "Gran, you're scaring me. What's wrong?" Eleanor reached across the table with weathered fingers and gently took the necklace from Sarah's hands. For a long moment, she simply stared at it, her pale blue eyes filling with tears that refused to fall. "I haven't seen this in over years," Eleanor finally said. "I thought it was lost forever in the fire." "What fire?" "Fort Mason burned down in 1993. It was a residential facility for girls. Troubled girls, they called us back then." Eleanor's voice carried the weight of decades-old pain. "I lived there for 3 years when I was your age." Sarah leaned forward, studying her grandmother's face. In all her 23 years, Eleanor had never mentioned living anywhere but the small town where Sarah had grown up visiting her every summer. The idea of her prim, proper grandmother being considered a troubled girl seemed impossible. "You never told me that." "Some stories are better left buried, sweetheart." Eleanor clutched the necklace tighter. But apparently some things refused to stay buried. The autumn wind rattled the windows of the old house, and Sarah pulled her cardigan closer around her shoulders. Outside, the maple trees were ablaze with red and gold, their leaves dancing in the crisp October air. It should have been a peaceful scene, but something about her grandmother's demeanor made the cozy kitchen feel suddenly cold. "Tell me about Fort Mason," Sarah pressed gently. "Please." Eleanor was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if she'd fallen asleep with her eyes open, something that had been happening more frequently as her health declined. But then she spoke, her voice taking on the cadence of someone traveling back through time. "Fort Mason wasn't really a fort. It was a large estate that had been converted into a home for girls whose families couldn't handle them anymore. Girls who'd gotten pregnant out of wedlock. Girls who'd been caught stealing or drinking or running around with boys. Girls who'd lost their parents and had nowhere else to go." Eleanor's fingers traced the engraving on the necklace. "I fell into the last category. Your parents died when you were young?" Sarah knew very little about her great-grandparents, only that they'd passed away before she was born. "Car accident. I was 17. Had just graduated high school, had plans to go to college, maybe become a teacher." Eleanor's laugh was bitter. "But I had no money, no family willing to take me in. The state decided Fort Mason was the best place for me until I turned 18 and could fend for myself." Sarah tried to imagine her grandmother as a scared 17-year-old girl alone in the world. It was difficult to reconcile that image with the strong, independent woman who had helped raise her after her own parents divorced when she was 10. "It sounds awful." "It wasn't all bad," Eleanor said, surprising her. "The woman who ran it, Mrs. Catherine Whitmore, she was strict but fair. She genuinely cared about us girls, wanted to see us succeed, and I made friends there. Real friends." Her voice softened. "There was a group of US 5 girls who looked out for each other. We called ourselves the Fort Mason 5. What happened to them?" Eleanor's expression darkened again. "That's the complicated part." Before Sarah could ask what she meant, Eleanor pushed herself up from the table with considerable effort. "Help me to the attic. There's something I need to show you." The narrow stairs creaked under their weight as they climbed to the 3rd floor of the old Victorian house. Sarah had explored the attic countless times as a child, but it had been years since she'd been up there. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light from the single bare bulb Eleanor pulled on with a string. The space was cramped and filled with the accumulated memories of decades-old furniture covered in sheets, boxes of photographs, her late grandfather's army uniforms, and stacks of books that smelled like vanilla and old paper. Eleanor moved, with surprising purpose, toward a corner where a small trunk sat hidden behind, a dress form draped in what looked like a wedding gown from the 1950s. "Help me move this," Eleanor said, indicating the trunk. Sarah lifted one end while her grandmother took the other, and together they carried it to the center of the attic where the light was better. The trunk was made of dark wood with brass corners and a brass lock that had long since been broken. Eleanor opened it carefully, as if it might contain something dangerous. Inside were photographs, letters, newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be official documents. Eleanor pulled out a group photograph and handed it to Sarah. "That's us, the Fort Mason 5. Sarah studied the black and white photograph. 5 young women stood arm in arm in front of a large, imposing building that looked like a cross between a mansion and an institution. They were all dressed in simple dark dresses, but despite the formal pose, their faces radiated youth and defiance. She could easily identify her grandmother, the same strong jawline and determined eyes, though her hair was darker and her face unlined by age. "You look happy," Sarah observed. We were, in our own way. We had each other. Eleanor pointed to each girl in turn. "That's me, of course. Next to me is Helen Rodriguez. She was from California. Got sent to Fort Mason because she'd been caught with a married man. Next to her is Dorothy Chun. Her parents died in a factory fire, and she had no other family. Then there's Rebecca Thornton. She came from money, but her parents discovered she was pregnant and shipped her off to Fort Mason to have the baby in secret. And finally, Mary Catherine O'Brien. She'd been stealing from the department store, where she worked to feed her younger siblings after their father abandoned them." Sarah looked closer at each face, trying to memorize them. These women had been her grandmother's chosen family during what must have been one of the most difficult periods of her life. "Where are they now?" Eleanor's silence stretched on so long that Sarah looked up from the photograph to find her grandmother staring into the distance with that same haunted expression. "That's what I've been trying to figure out for 30 years. "What do you mean?" Eleanor pulled out a newspaper clipping. From the trunk, the headline read, "Residential facility destroyed in suspicious fire, 5 residents missing." Sarah's blood went cold as she read the date, October 15th, 1993. "I don't understand. You said you lived there when you were 17. You would have been 46 in 1993, Eleanor finished. "I know how it sounds, Sarah, but Helen called me in September of that year. She was desperate, said she needed help, said all of us needed to come back to Fort Mason, that something terrible was going to happen if we didn't." Sarah set the photograph down carefully. "Come back, but you'd left decades earlier. We had, but we'd stayed in touch over the years. All 5 of us, we'd call each other on birthdays, send Christmas cards. We'd even had a few reunions." Eleanor's hands were shaking more noticeably now, but Helen's call was different. She was scared, said she'd discovered something about our time at Fort Mason that we needed to know. She wouldn't tell me over the phone, insisted we all needed to be there together. "Did you go?" "I was supposed to. We all were. Helen had arranged for us to meet there on October 16th, 1993, Eleanor's voice broke slightly. "But I got sick the night before, came down with the worst flu of my life. I was so disappointed, but I called Helen to let her know I couldn't make it." Sarah looked at the newspaper clipping again. "The fire was on October 15th, the day before. You were supposed to meet?" Helen never answered when I called. None of them did. Eleanor pulled out more newspaper clippings. "The building burned to the ground. The fire department said it started in the old kitchen, but they found evidence of accelerant in multiple locations. Someone had deliberately set that fire, and the 5 missing residents, that's just it, there weren't supposed to be any residents. Fort Mason had closed as a residential facility in 1987. It was supposed to be empty except for a caretaker, who came by once a week to check on the property." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature in the attic. "So who were the 5 missing people?" "The newspaper never identified them. The police said they couldn't find any records of who was supposed to be in the building that night." Eleanor looked directly at Sarah. "But I know who they were. Helen, Dorothy, Rebecca, and Mary Catherine. My 4 best friends went to that meeting without me, and they never came home." The implications of what her grandmother was saying began to sink in. "You think someone killed them? I think someone lured them there and burned the building down with them inside." Eleanor's voice was steady now, but Sarah could see the pain behind her eyes. "And I think I was supposed to die with them. But why? Why would someone want to hurt you?" Eleanor pulled out a manila envelope from the bottom of the trunk. "Because of what we knew about Fort Mason, what we discovered during our last year there." Sarah watched as her grandmother opened the envelope and pulled out what appeared to be official documents, birth certificates, medical records, and what looked like legal papers. Mrs. Whitmore wasn't just running a home for troubled girls, Eleanor said quietly. She was running an illegal adoption ring. The pieces began clicking into place in Sarah's mind. The pregnant girls who came to Fort Mason had their babies taken from them and sold to wealthy families who couldn't have children of their own. Eleanor's voice was bitter. "We discovered it by accident during our last month there. Rebecca was helping Mrs. Whitmore with filing in her office when she found records showing that babies born at Fort Mason were being placed with families who had paid substantial fees that went far beyond what legitimate adoption agencies charged. You found proof. We copied everything we could get our hands on. Names, dates, amounts of money that changed hands. We documented everything." Eleanor gestured to the papers in front of them. "But we were just kids. We didn't know what to do with the information. Why didn't you go to the police?" This was 1964. "Sarah, we were unwed mothers and orphans, and girls from broken homes. Who was going to believe us over a respected woman like Catherine Whitmore? She had connections throughout the state, people who vouched for her character." Sarah picked up one of the documents, a birth certificate for a baby born to Rebecca Thornton in May 1964. Next to it was a legal document showing the same baby being adopted by a family in Boston just 3 days later. along with a receipt, showing that the adoptive family had paid $5,000 a fortune in 1964. So you kept quiet? We were scared. Mrs. Whitmore suspected we knew something. We could tell by the way she watched us those last few weeks. We made a pact that we'd wait until we were all safely away from Fort Mason, and then we'd decide what to do together. But you never did anything. Eleanor's shoulders sagged. We were young, and we got caught up in building our own lives. I met your grandfather, got married, had your father, the others moved away, started families of their own. Years passed, and it began to feel like something that had happened to other people in another lifetime, until Helen's phone call. Helen never forgot. Apparently, none of them did. Eleanor pulled out a letter from the envelope. This came in the mail a week after the fire. No return address, postmarked from a town I'd never heard of. Sarah unfolded the letter. It was written in careful handwriting on plain white paper. Eleanor, if you're reading this, then I'm already dead. I've been investigating what happened at Fort Mason, trying to find the families who adopted the babies. I discovered something that changes everything. Mrs. Whitmore didn't die in 1987 like we all thought. She's still alive, and she's been watching us, all of us. She knows we have the documents, and she'll do anything to protect her secrets. Don't trust anyone. Don't go to the police. Hide the evidence and forget about Fort Mason. Some secrets are worth dying for, but they're not worth living for. Sarah read the letter twice before setting it down with shaking hands. Mrs. Whitmore was still alive in 1993. According to Helen, yes. And if Helen was right, she orchestrated the fire to get rid of the 4 people who could expose her crimes. But why kill them? Why not just threaten them, or try to buy their silence? Eleanor pulled out another document, a newspaper clipping from 1992. The headline read, "Former residential facility director named in adoption fraud investigation." Because the authorities were finally starting to ask questions. Helen had been contacted by investigators looking into illegal adoption practices in the 1960s. Someone else had come forward with similar allegations about Fort Mason. Sarah read the article quickly. It mentioned that Catherine Whitmore, former director of Fort Mason Residential Facility, was being sought for questioning in connection with alleged illegal adoption practices dating back to the 1960s. The article noted that Mrs. Whitmore's current whereabouts were unknown, as she had not been seen at her last known address in over a year. So Helen, reaching out to all of you, probably triggered Mrs. Whitmore to take action. If all 5 of us had gotten together and decided to cooperate with the investigation, we would have had enough evidence to put her away for the rest of her life. Sarah stared at the pile of documents and photographs spread out before them. The weight of her grandmother's 30-year secret was overwhelming, but something else was bothering her. Gran, if all of this is true, if Mrs. Whitmore really did kill your friends to protect her secrets, then why are you telling me now? Why risk? She stopped mid-sentence as realization hit her. The necklace. Someone sent you the necklace. Eleanor nodded slowly. It arrived in the mail yesterday. No note, no return address, just the necklace in a small box. Which means Catherine Whitmore knows I'm still alive, and she wants me to know that she knows. The temperature in the attic seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sarah looked around at the shadows cast by the old furniture and family heirlooms, suddenly feeling like they were being watched. We need to call the police and tell them what I suspect, a woman who would be over 100 years old now of committing murder 30 years ago, that I received a mysterious necklace in the mail. Eleanor shook her head. They'll think I'm a senile old woman with an overactive imagination, but the documents are 30 years old and prove adoption fraud, not murder. And even if the police believed me, what would they do? Launch an investigation that might put me in danger. Sarah picked up the necklace again, studying the engraving. Return to Fort Mason. But if the place burned down, the land is still there. And according to Helen's letter, Mrs. Whitmore has been watching us. If she sent this necklace, she wants me to go there. That's exactly why you can't go. It's obviously a trap. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photograph of the Fort Mason 5. When she finally spoke, her voice was determined in a way that Sarah hadn't heard in years. Those girls were my family when I had no one else. They died, because I wasn't there to die with them. I've spent 30 years wondering if I could have saved them, if things would have been different if I hadn't gotten sick that night. Gran, that's survivor's guilt talking. You can't. I'm 87 years old. Sarah, I have maybe a few good years left, and I've spent 30 of them carrying this weight. Eleanor carefully placed the documents back in the envelope. I can't go to my grave knowing that the woman who killed my friends is still out there, still free. So what are you suggesting? Eleanor looked directly at her granddaughter. I'm suggesting we go to Fort Mason and find out what Catherine Whitmore wants. I can't do this alone, sweetheart, and I won't ask you to help me if you're not willing. But Helen was right about one thing: some secrets aren't worth living for. I'm tired of being afraid. Sarah looked at her grandmother. Welly looked at her. Despite her age and frailty, there was steel in Eleanor's eyes that reminded Sarah of the defiant young woman in the photograph. This wasn't the confused elderly person that some people saw when they met Eleanor. This was a woman who had survived incredible hardship and loss, who had built a life and raised a family despite everything that had been taken from her. Where is Fort Mason? About 2 hours north of here, up in the mountains. The property backs up to state forest, land isolated, private. And you really think Mrs. Whitmore is still alive? I think someone who knew about the necklace sent it to me. Whether that's Catherine Whitmore herself or someone working for her, I don't know. But I think if we go there, we'll get answers. Sarah thought about her quiet life working as a freelance graphic designer, her small apartment in the city, her routine of coffee shops and yoga classes, and dinner with friends. It all seemed incredibly mundane compared to the story her grandmother had just shared. When do you want to go? Eleanor smiled for the first time since Sarah had found the necklace. Tomorrow. If we're going to do this, we shouldn't wait and give her time to change her mind or set up something worse. That evening, Sarah sat in her car outside her grandmother's house, talking to her best friend Jessica on the phone. Let me get this straight, Jessica said. Your grandmother thinks she's being stalked by a 100-year-old woman who may or may not have murdered 4 people 30 years ago. And you're planning to drive to some burned-out property in the mountains to confront her? When you put it like that, it sounds crazy. It sounds insane. Sarah, your grandmother is almost 90. Sometimes elderly people develop paranoia, or I saw the documents. Jess, the newspaper clippings, the adoption records. This isn't some fantasy she's made up, okay? But even if everything she told you is true, why would you put yourself in danger? Call the police. Call the FBI. Call someone who actually knows how to handle this kind of situation. Sarah had been asking herself the same questions all evening. The logical part of her brain agreed completely with Jessica, but every time she thought about backing out, she remembered the look in her grandmother's eyes when she talked about her friends, the love and loss and guilt that had been eating at her for 3 decades. She's not going to live much longer, Jess. Her health is declining. She's moving into assisted living next month. If I don't help her do this now, she'll never get closure. Closure, Sarah. This isn't about closure. This is about putting you both in danger for something that happened before you were even born. Those women were her family, and she's mine. Jessica sighed heavily. If you're really going to do this crazy thing, at least let me help. I'll follow you up there in my car. Stay nearby in case something goes wrong. I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking. I'm offering. Because apparently, I care about you too much to let you disappear into the mountains with your grandmother to confront a potential serial killer. Despite everything, Sarah found herself smiling. You really think Mrs. Whitmore is still alive? I think people have done stranger things to protect their secrets, and I think you're both braver and more foolish than I gave you credit for. After they hung up, Sarah sat in the darkness for a while, looking up at the lighted windows of her grandmother's house. In less than 24 hours, Eleanor would be moving into assisted living, leaving behind the home where she'd lived for over 50 years. It occurred to Sarah that maybe this trip wasn't just about solving an old mystery. Maybe it was about her grandmother taking control of her own story one last time before age and infirmity took that choice away from her. The next morning dawned, gray and overcast, with the kind of heavy clouds that promised rain before evening. Sarah packed a bag with bottled water, snacks, a first aid kit, and her phone charger. She also packed pepper spray and a knife her ex-boyfriend had given her for camping trips, though she hoped she wouldn't need either. Eleanor was waiting on her front porch when Sarah arrived, dressed practically in dark jeans, sturdy boots, and a warm jacket. She looked more alert and energetic than Sarah had seen her in months. Ready? Eleanor asked, climbing into the passenger seat of Sarah's Honda Civic. Are we ever ready for something like this? As they drove north, leaving the familiar suburban neighborhoods behind for rolling farmland and eventually steep, forested hills, Eleanor shared more memories of her time at Fort Mason. She talked about the other girls who had lived there, the daily routines that had provided structure during a chaotic time in her life, and the way Mrs. Whitmore had managed to be both maternal and terrifying at the same time. She had this way of making you feel like she genuinely cared about your future while also making it clear that crossing her would have consequences, Eleanor explained as they wound their way up a narrow mountain road. The girls who caused trouble had a way of disappearing, transferred to other facilities, she would tell us, but we never heard from them again. Do you think she was getting rid of girls who asked too many questions even back then? I think Catherine Whitmore was a woman who would do whatever necessary to protect her operation, and I think we were naive to believe we could just walk away and never face consequences for what we knew. The GPS on Sarah's phone indicated they were getting close to their destination, though they hadn't seen any signs of civilization for the past 20 minutes. The forest was thick on both sides of the road, the canopy so dense that it blocked out most of the already limited sunlight. There, Eleanor said suddenly, pointing to a rusted metal sign barely visible through overgrown vegetation. Fort Mason Road. Sarah turned onto what was less a road than a dirt path full of potholes and fallen branches. Her car bounced and scraped along the uneven surface as they climbed higher into the mountains. After about a mile, the path opened into a large clearing where the skeletal remains of a massive building stood against the gray sky. Even 30 years after the fire, Fort Mason was an imposing sight. The stone foundation and brick chimney had survived, along with portions of walls that reached toward the sky like broken fingers. Charred wood beams lay scattered around the ruins, and Sarah could see where investigators had cleared paths through the debris, though those paths were now overgrown with weeds and small trees. "My God," Eleanor whispered, staring at the remains of the place where she'd spent 3 years of her life. "It's smaller than I remembered." Sarah parked the car at the edge of the clearing, and they sat in silence for a moment, both taking in the desolate scene. The only sounds were the wind through the trees and the distant call of a crow. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Eleanor was already unbuckling her seatbelt. "I've come this far." They climbed out of the car and walked slowly toward the ruins. Up close, Sarah could see that the fire had been incredibly hot and thorough. Very little remained that was recognizable as having once been part of a building where people lived and worked. "The kitchen was over there," Eleanor said, pointing to a section of foundation on the far side of the ruins. "That's where the fire supposedly started. And where were your rooms?" "Second floor, east wing." Eleanor gestured to an area where nothing remained but scattered bricks and twisted metal. "The 5 of us had rooms right next to each other." Sarah tried to imagine the building as it had been, full of young women dealing with circumstances beyond their control, all under the supervision of a woman who was secretly exploiting their vulnerability for profit. The weight of all that suffering seemed to hang in the air like smoke from the long-dead fire. "Hello, Eleanor." Both women spun around at the sound of the voice. Standing at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden in the shadow of the trees, was an elderly woman leaning heavily on a walking cane. She was small and frail-looking, with white hair pulled back in a neat bun and wearing a long coat that seemed too heavy for the weather. "Catherine," Eleanor said, and Sarah heard decades of fear and anger compressed into that single word. Mrs. Catherine Whitmore stepped into the clearing, moving slowly but with purpose. She had to be at least 95 years old, but her eyes were sharp and alert as they fixed on Eleanor. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Mrs. Whitmore said. "After all these years, I thought you might have lost your nerve." "I never had much nerve to begin with," Eleanor replied, "but I had good friends who deserved better than what you gave them." Mrs. Whitmore's laugh was dry and humorless. "Your friends should have minded their own business. They should have left well enough alone." Sarah stepped closer to her grandmother, her hand moving instinctively toward the pepper spray in her pocket. "You killed them." "I protected them," Mrs. Whitmore said, her gaze shifting to Sarah. "Just as I protected all the girls who came through Fort Mason. I gave them purpose, gave their suffering meaning. You sold their babies. I found loving homes for children who would otherwise have been raised by girls too young and too poor to care for them properly. I created families for people who desperately wanted children. I solved problems." Eleanor took a step forward. "You destroyed lives. You took advantage of girls who had nowhere else to turn. I gave those girls a chance to start over with clean slates. They could go back into the world without the burden of illegitimate children or the shame of their circumstances." Mrs. Whit's voice carried the conviction of someone who had spent decades justifying her actions to herself. "The money I received was simply compensation for the services I provided. And when Helen and the others threatened to expose you, they threatened to destroy the lives of hundreds of families' adoptive parents who had done nothing wrong, children who had grown up loved and cared for. Helen was going to tear apart families to satisfy her own guilt over choices she had made decades earlier." Sarah felt sick listening to the woman's twisted logic. "So, you killed them." "I protected them from making a terrible mistake, just as I've spent the last 30 years protecting Eleanor." Eleanor's face went pale. "What do you mean? Did you really think it was a coincidence that you got sick the night before you were supposed to meet your friends? Did you think your flu came out of nowhere?" The implications of what Mrs. Whitmore was saying hit Sarah like a physical blow. "You poisoned her." "I gave her just enough to keep her home that night, enough to save her life." Mrs. Whitmore smiled, and the expression was chilling on her aged face. "I've been watching over all of you for 30 years, Eleanor, making sure you stayed safe, stayed quiet. I've known where you lived, where you worked, when your husband died, when your granddaughter was born." Eleanor's hands were shaking now, but her voice remained steady. "Why? And there might be other families out there who deserve to know the truth about their adoptions." Sarah pulled into the parking lot of a small diner and watched as her grandmother walked slowly toward the payphone near the building's entrance. Eleanor may have been 87 years old and facing the most difficult revelation of her life, but she was still the same woman who had survived losing her parents at 17, who had built a life and raised a family despite everything that had been taken from her. Some secrets, Sarah realized, weren't worth keeping just because revealing them was difficult. Some kinds of peace weren't worth the price they demanded, and some forms of justice were worth pursuing even when the people seeking that justice might not live to see it achieved. As Eleanor dialed the number she had apparently memorized decades ago, Sarah thought about the necklace that had started this entire journey. Return to Fort Mason. Maybe the message hadn't been a threat after all. Maybe it had been an invitation to finally tell a story that had been buried too long. 3 weeks later, Sarah sat in a federal courthouse in the state capitol, watching as FBI agents presented evidence in a case that had been reopened after 30 years. Eleanor sat beside her, frail but determined, as she testified about what she had witnessed at Fort Mason in the 1960s and what she had learned about her friends. Deaths. In 1993, Catherine Whitmore had died 2 days after their confrontation in the mountains, taking many of her secrets with her, but the investigation she had tried so hard to prevent was moving forward anyway, bringing closure to families who had spent decades wondering about their origins and seeking justice for the young women whose voices had been silenced too long. Sarah held her grandmother's hand as Eleanor finished her testimony, thinking about the courage it took to face painful truths and the ways that secrets could poison lives across generations. The necklace that had started it all sat in an evidence bag on the prosecutor's table, its message finally fulfilled. Outside the courthouse, Eleanor paused on the steps and looked back at the building where her story had finally been told in full. She was moving into assisted living the next day, but she no longer looked like a woman carrying the weight of unfinished business. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Sarah asked. Eleanor smiled, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from her in weeks. "I think Helen and Dorothy and Mary Catherine would have wanted their story told. Even Rebecca. Despite everything, we all deserve better than what Catherine Whitmore gave us." As they walked to the car, Sarah thought about the Fort Mason Five and the bonds that had sustained them through impossible circumstances. 4 of them were gone now, but their story lived on in the testimony that would help other families find truth and closure. Sometimes justice took 30 years to arrive, but that didn't make it any less worth waiting for. The autumn sun broke through the clouds as they drove home, casting long shadows across the road ahead. Sarah reached over and squeezed her grandmother's hand, thinking about the stories we inherit from the people we love and the courage it takes to see those stories through to their proper endings.